She returned a day early from the trip and saw her husband at the airport. He was holding flowers and passionately saying goodbye to a much younger woman. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy. The air in New York City, thick with ambition and exhaust, had never felt so alien to Emily Carter. It was nearly 8 on a Thursday that should have been Friday. The flight from Chicago, bringing her back from an exhausting but triumphant series of meetings for her marketing consultancy, had been bumped up. A small stroke of luck, she thought as she boarded. She'd get home a day early without the accumulated fatigue and maybe plan a surprise for Michael. Dinner, perhaps. Something simple, a bottle of his favorite Cabernet, a conversation free from the pressures of routine. A breather. The irony of fate, however, is that it has a cruel and timely sense of humor. The surprise was indeed set up, but the role of the shocked spectator was hers. The arrivals hall at JFK Airport buzzed with its usual chaotic energy, people hugging, crying, smiling, suitcases gliding across the polished floor, flight announcements echoing over the speakers. Emily, standing near the baggage carousel, felt her body aching from the intense work week. Her mind, though, was light, satisfied with the deals she'd closed. She just wanted her suitcase, the comfort of her car, and the quiet of her apartment on the Upper East Side. That's when she saw him. Michael. The husband she'd shared her life with for nearly a decade. The man whose routine she knew like the back of her hand. He was there about 20 yards away, and a smile she hadn't seen directed at her in years lit up his face. It was a smile of pure, genuine happiness, the kind that transforms an ordinary face into something magnetic. In his hands, a vibrant bouquet of sunflowers, the blooms glowing an almost aggressive yellow under the terminal's harsh lights. And propped on the ground, a sign, a white poster board with colorful, clumsy letters spelling out a name that wasn't hers. "Welcome back, Jessica." Poorly drawn hearts floated around the name like something made by a lovesick teenager. Michael, her Michael, the pragmatic financial analyst who'd once given her a set of household organization spreadsheets as a birthday gift, was there, starring in a scene straight out of a rom-com. The initial shock hit like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of her. He shouldn't be there. He thought she'd only arrive the next day. That setup, that explosion of cheesy romance, wasn't for her. And then, as if the universe's script needed one more cliché, the owner of the name appeared. A girl, no, a young woman who couldn't be more than 21, came running from the arrivals area. Long dark hair flying behind her, a short dress defying the mild evening chill, and a smile that looked rehearsed for a teeth-whitening commercial. She dashed toward him, her colorful wheeled suitcase bouncing wildly. Michael dropped the sign, which hit the floor with a dull thud, and opened his arms. The girl didn't hesitate. She launched herself at him, her legs wrapping around his waist in an agile, brazen move, and he caught her, lifting her off the ground and spinning her in the crowded hall. The world around them seemed to vanish, lost in their bubble of cinematic passion. The kiss that followed was the final confirmation, the exclamation point on a sentence of betrayal. It wasn't a peck, not a kiss of longing. It was a movie kiss, long, hungry, shameless, that made an elderly couple near Emily avert their eyes, embarrassed. She watched it all, frozen, her body petrified behind a pillar. The blood in her veins seemed to turn to ice. There were no tears, no scream caught in her throat. The pain was there, a sharp, deep stab in her chest, but it was immediately smothered by something stronger, colder, a cutting clarity. The anger would come later, she knew. The grief, maybe. But in that instant, in that suspended moment as she watched the man she loved kiss another woman with a devotion he'd never given her, Emily Carter felt only one thing, an absolute, unshakable certainty that her marriage, the life she knew, was over. And the scariest part was the calm with which her brain processed that information. It was as if a part of her, a part she'd kept dormant, had just awakened, ready to take control. She watched for another minute, which felt like an eternity. Saw him set her down with a gentleness that made her nauseous. Saw her laugh, a high-pitched youthful sound that cut through the ambient noise. Saw him grab her suitcase, that same colorful wheeled bag, and walk with his arm around her slim waist. They passed just a few yards from where she stood, close enough that Emily could smell her perfume, a sweet, cloying fragrance that hung in the air. Michael didn't see her. Why would he? In his mind, his wife was hundreds of miles away, safe in her ignorance, allowing him to live his fantasy uninterrupted. He led her toward the exit, toward the parking lot, probably to the car they'd bought together, whose payments came from the joint account she, with her strategic mind, managed. Emily stayed there, frozen, her hand still resting on the cold pillar, until the baggage carousel started turning again, bringing her plain black suitcase. She grabbed it, the motion automatic, mechanical, walked to the exit, her heart beating in a strangely steady rhythm. There was no panic, no despair. There was only a heavy silence inside her, a vacuum where love and trust had once been. When she reached her own car in the upper level of the parking garage, she sat in the driver's seat and stared into nothing. The bouquet of sunflowers, the sign, the kiss. The images replayed in her mind, not like a horror movie, but like pieces of a puzzle she could finally see assembled. The coldness with which she analyzed the scene scared her. It was the same coldness she used to dissect a client's marketing problem, to find the flaw, the weakness, and build a new strategy from the rubble. And in that moment, her marriage was just that, a failed project that needed to be liquidated. The woman who would cry, who would feel betrayed and abandoned, was still there somewhere. But the strategist, the woman who'd built a company from scratch, who negotiated with market sharks and always won, that woman was in command now. And she was already planning her next move. The drive from the airport to the apartment on the Upper East Side was made in an almost meditative silence. The lights of New York City, which normally captivated her with their endless dance of life and movement, passed as indistinct blurs through the car window. Emily drove with robotic precision, her hands steady on the wheel, her mind operating at a level of clarity that bordered on the supernatural. The pain, the humiliation, the sadness, all of it was dammed up somewhere deep, kept at bay by a wall of pure, icy rationality. The woman who felt had been put to sleep. The strategist was fully awake. As she parked in the building's garage, the sound of the engine shutting off echoed in the silence, like a switch being flipped. The observation phase was over. The action phase was beginning. She rode up in the service elevator, a habit she'd picked up to avoid small talk with neighbors, opened the apartment door and stepped inside. The air was still, infused with the familiar scent of her own home. The smell of books, that morning's coffee, the subtle perfume she wore. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The white linen curtains, spotless. The coffee mug she'd used that morning still on the sink, waiting to be washed. The cashmere throw folded over the sofa arm. It was their sanctuary, the refuge they'd built together against the chaos of the outside world. But now, in the light of betrayal, everything seemed fake. Their meticulously staged theater set, whose rotten backstage she'd just discovered. Every object, every piece of furniture seemed to mock her, a silent accomplice to a farce she'd been starring in unknowingly. Emily didn't turn on the main lights. She left only the living room lamp on, creating a play of shadows that mirrored the duality of her life. She walked to the office, a room they shared, though it was mostly her space, where ideas for her consultancy were born. Michael's laptop was there, closed on the dark wood desk. He always boasted about his organization, his infallible memory for numbers and data. Michael, the financial analyst at a major multinational, the man who lived by predicting risks and analyzing patterns. He saw himself as a master of logic, a man incapable of a basic error. And it was exactly that arrogance, that predictability disguised as complexity, that would be his downfall. Emily sat in his chair, the leather still warm, and opened the laptop. The screen lit up, asking for the password. A thin, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips. The password. Michael, in his sentimental and cheap logic, used the same one for everything he considered personal. The date they got married. 8 digits that once symbolized the start of a life and now would be the key to its end. She typed the numbers without hesitation. Access granted. What opened before her eyes was Pandora's box of her husband's double life. It wasn't just an affair, a slip-up, it was a project, an investment. In minutes, the world Emily believed was solid and real crumbled into pixels and bytes on the glowing screen. The messaging app was open, and the chat with Jess Hearts was pinned at the top. Jessica Thompson, a college student from Albany. The messages scrolled back for months, a detailed diary of a romance blooming behind her back. There were mushy declarations of love, plans for the future, intimate photos exchanged on late nights when he claimed to be working on urgent reports. There were hotel reservations in cities he traveled to for work, weekends in the Hamptons, a trip to Miami during a conference that never existed. There were screenshots of airline tickets, always bought with the supplementary credit card he kept for emergencies. But what solidified the ice in her veins was the online banking tab. Michael, the finance master, was meticulous even in his domestic corruption. There was a spreadsheet titled Expenses J, and in it a detailed record of every penny spent on the mistress. Monthly transfers, labeled as living allowance, covering rent for an apartment in Albany. Receipts for tuition payments at a private design college, invoices from online shopping at designer stores, imported perfumes, bags, shoes. He wasn't just cheating on his wife. He was funding an entire life for someone else. He was taking the money they saved together for the beach house renovation, for the trip to Europe they'd planned for years, and using it to build the dream of a girl young enough to be his daughter. The money that represented Emily's sweat, her sleepless nights building her company, was being converted into luxuries for a stranger. The nausea rose in her throat, but she swallowed it. The tears didn't come. The wounded woman screamed in silence, but the strategist was in absolute control. With the precision of a surgeon, Emily opened a new folder on her own external hard drive, an encrypted device she used for her client's most sensitive data. The folder was named with a simple code, Operation Freedom, and then the work began. She saved every bank statement, every transfer receipt, took screenshots of every chat screen, every love declaration, every photo. Downloaded the emails with hotel bookings and airline tickets, cross-referenced the dates of the secret trips with Michael's work calendar, highlighting the lies. Every late meeting that coincided with a dinner at an expensive restaurant, every business trip that matched a romantic weekend. In less than 3 hours, what had been a painful suspicion turned into a dossier. An impeccable file, organized chronologically, with irrefutable proof not just of adultery, but of marital asset dissipation. It was a courtroom-ready case, served on a digital platter. She had the weapon, the ammunition, and the map for the controlled annihilation of Michael Carter. And as the sun began to show its first signs on New York City's horizon, Emily closed his laptop, leaned back in the chair, and, for the first time since seeing him at the airport, allowed herself a single, deep sigh. It wasn't a sigh of sadness. It was the sigh of someone who'd just drawn the perfect battle plan. The war hadn't started yet, but she already knew she'd win it. Friday dawned grey and humid, a perfect mirror of the mood that should have consumed Emily, but paradoxically didn't touch her. After a sleepless night fueled by coffee and cold adrenaline, she didn't feel the weight of fatigue. She felt energized, like a predator finally spotting its prey after a long stalk. The dossier, Operation Freedom, was secure on her external drive, a digital time bomb waiting for the exact moment to detonate. She took a long shower, chose a navy blue tailored pantsuit, a piece that exuded power and control, and pulled her hair into an impeccable bun. The woman in the mirror wasn't a victim. She was a general about to go to war, and every general knows the first battle is won by choosing the right allies. The name Victoria Hale wasn't just known in New York City's legal circles, it was a legend. A family law attorney who turned the law into a strategic art of war, famous for her discretion, her mind sharp as a scalpel, and a success rate that intimidated opponents before they even sat at the negotiation table. Victoria didn't handle divorces. She orchestrated marital dissolutions with the precision of a conductor, leading a complex symphony. Getting an emergency consultation with her was nearly impossible, but Emily, in her career, had learned that impossible was just a matter of finding the right approach. A call to an old client, a retired judge for whom her consultancy had done image repositioning work, and a slot miraculously opened in Victoria's schedule for 10 that morning. Victoria Hale's office in Midtown Manhattan wasn't flashy. On the contrary, its elegance lay in its understatement. Dark wood furniture, leather armchairs, select contemporary art pieces, and a silence that seemed to absorb all the city's chaos outside. Victoria Hale herself was the embodiment of her office, a woman in her 50s, with grey hair cut in an asymmetrical bob and eyes of such a clear blue they seemed capable of seeing through any facade. She didn't smile when Emily entered. She merely gestured to the chair across from her with a hand motion and said in a calm, inflectionless voice, "Sit down, Ms. Carter. The judge said it was urgent." Emily didn't waste time on preliminaries. There was no room for hesitation or sentimentality. She opened her laptop, connected the external drive, and projected the contents of the Operation Freedom folder onto the large screen on the wall. "The urgency, Ms. Hale, is documented here," she said, her voice firm. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screen. She said not a word as Emily, succinctly and objectively, narrated the facts: the airport sighting, the predictable password, the discovery of the double life, the funding of the mistress with marital assets. Victoria absorbed every piece of information, every image, every spreadsheet, with absolute concentration. She clicked through the files, zoomed in on images, read the chats, her eyes moving rapidly, processing data like a supercomputer. The silence in the room was so thick it could be cut. When Emily finished, Victoria leaned back in her leather chair, which creaked softly. She stayed silent for nearly a minute, her fingers drumming lightly on the mahogany desk. Her blue eyes, once analytical, now seemed to assess Emily, measuring her resilience, her determination. Finally she spoke, and her voice, though calm, carried the weight of hundreds of battles won. "Ms. Carter, in 25 years of practice, I've seen many cases of infidelity, many stupid husbands, but your husband isn't just stupid, he's arrogant, and arrogance is the most expensive mistake one can make in a divorce." She paused, her eyes locked on Emily's. "The documentation is impeccable. We have a winning case here. The question isn't if we'll win, but how. And that brings me to the most important question I'll ask you today." She leaned forward again, the intensity in her gaze deepening. "Do you want revenge, or do you want to win?" The question hung in the air, direct, cutting. Revenge was the heat, the explosion, the immediate satisfaction of seeing the other suffer. Winning was the cold, the strategy, the building of a solid future on the ruins of the past. For most, they'd be distinct paths. But Emily wasn't most people. The strategist within her saw revenge not as an end, but as a tool, a piece on the board. "I want both," she replied, without a hint of hesitation, her voice sounding more convinced than ever. "I want to win so completely, so overwhelmingly, that the victory itself is the greatest revenge of all." A glint of admiration, or perhaps recognition, passed through Victoria Hale's eyes. She nodded slowly, a nearly predatory smile forming on her lips for the first time. "I like you, Ms. Carter. I like your clarity." She turned to the screen, pointing to a chat exchange between Michael and a friend that Emily had highlighted. In it, Michael spoke enthusiastically about an impending promotion at the company, the position of financial manager, which would put him on a new level of power and salary. "He's going to get that promotion, isn't he?" Victoria asked rhetorically. "He's on top of the world. Conquered the career, has the trophy wife at home and the exciting young thing as an escape valve. He feels invincible." Victoria stood and began pacing the room, hands behind her back, like a general planning an attack. "If we file now, we catch him off guard, yes. But he's in a moment of euphoria. He'll fight, feel wronged, hire the best lawyer money can buy. It'll be a bloody battle, and though victory is ours, it'll be draining." She stopped at the window, looking out at the sea of skyscrapers. "But what if we wait?" She turned to Emily, her eyes shining with dangerous intelligence. "Let him believe he's at the peak. Let him get the promotion. Let him celebrate, feel like the king of the world, the master of the universe. Let him climb as high as he can on his pedestal of lies." The pause she made was dramatic, charged with anticipation. "And then when he's up there at the pinnacle of his glory, looking down on everyone, we pull the rug out. The fall won't just be financial, It'll be moral, public. The humiliation will be exponentially greater. The strategy was cruel, and it was perfect. It was exactly what the cold voice inside Emily craved. Not just to punish Michael, but to deconstruct him, to make him lose not just the money and the wife, but his very sense of identity built on a foundation of deceptions. Together, the two women dove into the plan. Emily would maintain the facade of the loyal, devoted wife. She'd support him, encourage him. She'd be the perfect partner during the weeks leading up to the promotion. The theater of the perfect life would continue, but now with a new script written by them. The day of the promotion would be the climax of Michael's ascent. And a few days later, at the height of his celebration, the process server would knock on his door. The petition for contested divorce wouldn't just be a legal document, it would be a manifesto, accompanied by the full dossier, detailing every lie, every diverted penny. It would be the bill for his betrayal, presented when he least expected it, in the most humiliating way possible. As she left Victoria Hale's office, Emily no longer felt like a general. She felt like the embodiment of justice, a patient, meticulous, and above all, implacable justice. The weeks that followed were the most exquisite performance of Emily's life. She, who made a living creating narratives and building images for major corporations, turned all her talent to the stage of her own home. She transformed into the lead actress in a play whose script only she and her lawyer knew. Each day was a carefully rehearsed act. She woke up, smiled, made coffee just the way Michael liked it, with the milk foam at the exact level. Asked about his work with interest that seemed genuine, listening to him talk about financial projections and board meetings, while her mind catalogued every word as fuel for the coming fire. She cooked his favorite dishes, ones she hadn't made in years, claiming a sudden wave of domestic inspiration. The apartment, which had once seemed a fake set, was now her stage, and she moved through it with the grace and confidence of a veteran. Michael, for his part, was the perfect audience, completely absorbed in himself. The impending promotion had left him in a state of egocentric euphoria. He saw Emily's renewed attention not as a performance, but as a natural consequence of his own success. In his arrogant mind, it was obvious his wife would be more devoted. After all, he was about to become an even more important man. He didn't notice the icy glint behind her smile, the calculated precision in her gestures of affection, the way her eyes followed him, not with love, but with the cold evaluation of a scientist observing a specimen. He was so enchanted with his own image reflected in her eyes that he didn't see the reflection was a mirage. He talked about his day, and she nodded, her mind working in the background, cross-checking information, imagining the expression on his face when the truth hit. He hugged her at night, a mechanical and guilty gesture, and she reciprocated, her body stiff under his touch, counting the seconds until he fell asleep, and she could breathe the pure air of her solitary revenge. The day of confirmation arrived on a rainy Tuesday. Michael called in the mid-afternoon, his voice exultant, almost childlike. "I got it, Em. It's official. I'm the new financial manager." Emily, on the other end of the line in her office, closed her eyes and composed her voice to sound choked with happiness. "Honey, that's amazing news. I knew it. I always knew. You deserve it more than anyone." The nausea was almost physical, but she turned it into words of celebration. He came home that night like a conqueror returning from war. In his arms, a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite flowers, information he seemed to have dredged up from some dead file in his memory, and a bottle of the most expensive champagne he could find. His face glowed, a mix of triumph and relief. He lifted her in his arms, spinning her around the room, a pathetic and unconscious imitation of the scene she'd witnessed at the airport. "This is just the beginning, babe," he said, as the champagne cork flew, hitting the ceiling with a dry pop. He filled 2 glasses, the golden liquid bubbling furiously. "We're gonna have the life we always wanted. Trips, the dream beach house, everything." He raised his glass for a toast, his eyes fixed on hers, seeking validation, admiration. Emily raised her own glass, the crystal cold in her fingers. She looked deep into his eyes, the smile on her lips a masterpiece of deception. She clinked her glass against his, the tinkling of the glass sounding like a sentence. "Yes," she replied, her voice smooth as silk, "the life we always wanted." In that moment, for him, The phrase was a promise of a shared future. For her, it was the confirmation of her imminent and solitary freedom. The plan, crafted with Victoria Hale's surgical precision, called for a 5-day interval between the celebration and the execution. 5 days for Michael's joy to settle, to become solid, real in his mind. 5 days for him to feel completely secure at the top of his mountain of lies. Emily suggested a special dinner for Saturday, just for us, to really celebrate your achievement. He loved the idea. He spent the following days floating, making plans out loud, talking about the new car they could buy, about the year-end bonus he'd get. And Emily fed his fantasy, agreeing, smiling, being the proud and complicit wife. Every smile of hers was another nail in the coffin of the life he knew. Saturday arrived. Emily prepared shrimp risotto, the dish she'd made on their first date, opened a bottle of expensive wine they'd been saving for a special occasion, lit candles, created the perfect atmosphere of intimacy and celebration. They dined, laughed. Michael told jokes, talked about his new subordinates, about the bigger office he'd have. He was relaxed, happy, completely disarmed. It was nearly 9, they were on dessert, a tiramisu she'd made herself, when the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the air, sharp and unexpected. Michael frowned. Expecting someone? Emily shook her head, her expression of confusion worthy of an Oscar. No. That's weird. Go see, maybe it's a neighbor needing something. Michael got up, still with the linen napkin in his lap, and walked to the door, a relaxed smile still on his lips. Emily stayed seated at the table, but her body was tense, every muscle primed for what was coming. She heard the door open, heard Michael's voice, "Can I help you?" And then another voice, male, formal, uttering the words that would echo in her mind forever. "Mr. Michael Carter, you've been served." The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. Emily stood slowly and walked to the entrance of the room, stopping at a safe distance where she could see the scene perfectly. Michael was frozen at the door, staring at a man in a dark suit handing him a large brown envelope. Michael's hand trembled as he took it. The man turned and left without another word. Michael closed the door slowly as if in a trance. The smile had vanished from his face, replaced by a mask of pure, total perplexity. He turned to Emily, the envelope in his hand like an alien artifact. "Emily, what is this?" he asked, his voice a confused whisper. Emily stared at him, the mask of the loving wife finally crumbling, revealing the cold, impassive face that had been hidden for weeks. She crossed her arms, her body a statue of ice and determination. "It's the summary of your new life, Michael," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Open it. Read it. I hope it was worth it." His hands, still trembling, tore the envelope clumsily. He pulled out the stack of papers. The first page was the petition for contested divorce, with Victoria Hale's name prominent in the header. His eyes widened. He flipped through the following pages, and his face began to lose color, turning from white to a greenish shade of shock. There were the photos of him with Jessica at the airport, the screenshots of the chats, the hotel reservations, the expenses J spreadsheet, the credit card statements with the luxury purchases. Every piece of the dossier was there, printed on official paper, attached to a legal proceeding that demanded not just divorce, but restitution of every penny spent on maintaining his double life. Michael's world, so solid and triumphant 5 minutes earlier, was disintegrating in his hands. He lifted his gaze from the paper, his eyes full of panic and disbelief, and focused on Emily, as if seeing her for the first time. And on her face, he found no pain, no anger, no sadness. He found only the calm, terrifying void of a final verdict. The sound of the papers hitting the wooden floor was the only noise to break the tomb-like silence of the apartment. Michael stared at the scattered sheets, proofs of his betrayal, now materialized and official, as if they were the ashes of his life. The initial shock, that moment of paralysis where the brain refuses to process reality, gave way to a wave of panic that made him stagger. He raised his gaze to Emily, and for the first time in a long time he really saw her. Not the comfortable wife, the familiar landscape of his routine, but a stranger. A woman with eyes of ice and an unshakable posture he never knew existed. The realization that the woman he'd underestimated for years was the architect of his impending ruin hit him with the force of a physical blow. "Emily, please, we can talk," he stammered, his voice cracking, words tumbling over each other. He took a step toward her, his hand extended in a gesture of supplication. Emily didn't move. "There's nothing to talk about, Michael. Everything that needed to be said is in those papers. I know everything. About the airport, Jessica, the trips, the money. I've known for weeks." Her confession hit him like a second punch. Weeks. That meant every smile, every dinner, every word of encouragement during the promotion run. It had all been a farce. He hadn't just been discovered. He'd been hunted. They'd toyed with him like a cat with a mouse before the final strike. The humiliation burned on his face, hotter and more painful than any other emotion. The shock turned to desperation. He fell to his knees, a pathetic and theatrical scene, tears finally welling in his eyes. "It was a mistake, Emily. A crazy thing. I got lost. I don't know what came over me. I fell in love, but it's you I love. I don't want to lose our marriage, our life." His words, which might once have evoked some compassion, now sounded hollow, insulting. Emily looked down at him, the man she'd once loved, now reduced to a groveling cliché. "You didn't fall in love, Michael. You got bored and decided to invest our money, our future, in an expensive hobby. You're not afraid of losing our marriage. You're afraid of losing the comfort, the status, the easy life I helped build and manage. But it's too late for fear. You've already lost." With a coldness that surprised her, she turned and went to the bedroom, locking the door behind her, leaving him alone with the wreckage of his life scattered on the living room floor. The following days were a blur of desperation for Michael. He tried everything, called incessantly, sent dozens of messages begging for forgiveness, showed up at her office only to be turned away by security. He reached out to mutual friends, trying to use them as mediators, but the story, leaked in a calculated and anonymous way, was already spreading, and no one wanted to get involved in what was clearly a minefield. While he thrashed about, the legal machinery set in motion by Victoria Hale moved with the speed and efficiency of a war machine. The petition, bolstered by the impeccable dossier, left no room for contest. Victoria didn't ask for just asset division. She invoked the clause for dissipation of marital assets, demanding not 50%, but 60% of the total estate in Emily's favor, plus full reimbursement, with interest and adjustments, of every penny Michael had diverted to the mistress. The tickets, the gifts, the college tuition, the rent. Everything was there, proven, totaled, irrefutable. Michael's lawyer, an expensive and arrogant man he'd hired in panic, read the petition and dossier, and his demeanor changed. He looked at his client and said without mincing words, "You don't stand a chance. Your wife and her lawyer built a fortress. If you fight, this goes to trial, and every one of those documents becomes public. Your career, your reputation, everything will be destroyed. The best we can do is negotiate the terms of your surrender." The word surrender sealed Michael's fate. There would be no battle, just the signing of his defeat. The judge, faced with the clarity of the evidence and lack of contest, granted Victoria's terms almost in full. In a quick and brutal hearing, the marriage was dissolved. Emily got the Upper East Side apartment, the main car, and a larger share of the savings and investments. Michael in turn saw his estate decimated. The fall wasn't just financial. Rumors about the scandal, the domestic embezzlement, as some maliciously nicknamed it, leaked into the multinational. His recent promotion, which should have been his great triumph, became a source of embarrassment for the board. No one accused him formally of anything, but the prestige he valued so much evaporated. Hallways went silent when he passed. Invites to lunches and informal meetings stopped. He became a pariah in his own kingdom. Without a home and with his bank account bleeding, Michael had no choice but to seek the only port left, Jessica. He packed his things into boxes and moved to the small apartment in Albany, the one he'd been paying for to start his new life. At first, Jessica received him like a tragic hero. The novelty of having him full-time, the drama of the situation, all seemed exciting. She dropped out of college soon after, declaring she wanted to dedicate herself to him and the life they'd build together. But the fantasy didn't survive the shock of reality. Michael, now stripped of his power and much of his wealth, was a bitter, anxious man obsessed with what he'd lost. The cohabitation, once punctuated by romantic weekends and expensive gifts, became a daily exercise in frustration. The girl, who once saw him as a provider of luxuries and adventures, now found herself stuck with an older man, moody and worried about money. She wanted parties, trips, the constant attention she got when she was an exciting secret. Michael, on the other hand, wanted peace. He wanted the comfortable silence of his old home, the predictable routine, the stability he'd imploded himself. But the peace he'd destroyed in his marriage, the peace he'd sacrificed on the altar of a selfish affair, was a ghost that would never return to haunt him with its absence. The new life he'd so desired revealed itself as a punishment far crueler than he could ever have imagined. While Michael's world contracted into a cycle of recriminations and regrets, Emily's expanded at a dizzying speed. The dissolution of the marriage wasn't an end, but an ignition. The energy she'd once devoted to maintaining a life for two, managing a home, and worrying about a partner who didn't deserve her, was redirected full force to herself and her career. The Upper East Side apartment, once a mausoleum of bittersweet memories, was the first to feel the transformation. Walls were knocked down, not just the plaster ones, but the symbolic ones. The shared office was annexed to the living room, creating a spacious, modern, inspiring workspace with a panoramic view of the city that now seemed to belong solely to her. The sober colors gave way to shades of moss green, terracotta, and petrol blue. Every object, every piece of furniture was chosen by her, for her. The home stopped being a nest and became a base of operations, the headquarters of a woman rediscovering her own strength. This external renewal was just a reflection of the internal revolution. Emily dove into work with a passion and focus that bordered on obsession. Operation Freedom, as she called her divorce, had taught her a valuable lesson about strategy, risk, and the importance of flawless execution. She applied that same implacable mindset to her business. Her consultancy, Carter Marketing, was rebranded to Aura Creative Strategy. The name Carter was the first thing discarded, a remnant of a life that no longer belonged to her. With a new name and new energy, she pursued bolder clients, more challenging projects. Her reputation, already solid, was amplified by the discreet buzz surrounding her divorce in elite circles. She wasn't seen as a victim, but as a powerful player who'd won a personal battle with brutal elegance. That aura of power and control became her greatest marketing asset. In a few months, Aura Creative Strategy became one of the most sought-after consultancies in New York City. Emily appeared on the cover of a major business magazine in an article titled "The Architecture of Success: Women Redesigning the Market." The cover photo showed her in her new office, the New York skyline behind her, her gaze firm, a subtle smile of someone who knows her own worth. She started being invited to speak at major corporate events, talking about branding, crisis management, and building powerful narratives. In each lecture, without ever citing her personal drama, she conveyed a message of resilience and self-sufficiency that resonated deeply with the audience. She wasn't just teaching marketing, she was teaching power. Her social life, once limited to couples' dinners and corporate events beside Michael, blossomed. She rediscovered old friendships, made new connections, and learned to enjoy her own company, traveling solo on weekends, exploring restaurants she'd always wanted to try, living without the need for anyone else's approval or presence. Emily didn't just reborn, she sculpted herself from the raw marble of her pain into a version of herself stronger, more authentic, and infinitely freer. A year passed, a year since the night the doorbell rang and Michael's world collapsed. Emily was at the top. Her company had tripled in size, and she now led a team of 10. Life was full, challenging, and above all, hers. It was at a launch event for a tech conglomerate, an event her own agency had helped conceive, that she saw him again. The encounter was so banal it seemed scripted by chance. She was chatting with the host company's CEO when she felt a heavy gaze on her. She turned discreetly and found him. Michael. He was near the bar, alone, holding a glass of whiskey with an unsteady hand. Time hadn't been kind to him. The air of success and arrogance had been replaced by an aura of defeat. He looked older, shoulders slumped, suit a bit too loose, as if he'd shrunk inside himself. There were deep bags under his eyes, and his hair, once always impeccable, was thin and lifeless. Emily felt nothing. No stab of revenge, no cruel satisfaction, just the cold indifference one feels observing a stranger. She turned her attention back to the conversation, but knew the encounter was inevitable. Minutes later he approached, hesitant. "Emily." His voice was lower, devoid of its old self-assurance. She turned, offering him a polite smile, the same she'd give any distant acquaintance. "Michael, how are you?" The question was rhetorical. The answer was stamped on his face. I'm fine," he lied, poorly. You look incredible. The event is fantastic. Congratulations." "Thank you." "Phi Team did an excellent job," she replied, subtly putting him in his place. He was a guest, she was part of the force behind the success. An awkward silence settled. He seemed to struggle for words. "I heard that. You and Jessica aren't together anymore," Emily said, not as a question but as a statement. It was information that had reached her through third parties months ago. His face twisted in a grimace of pain. "She left 6 months ago. Said I'd become a sad man and she didn't want to waste her youth on my midlife crisis. The irony was so thick it could be cut with a knife." He looked at Emily, his eyes moist with self-pity. "I lost everything, Emily. Everything. I think about you every day, about what we had, what I threw away for nothing. I was an idiot, a blind, arrogant idiot." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Is there a chance to talk? To start over?" Emily observed him, and for the first time felt a flicker of something resembling pity. Not for him, but for the pathetic figure he'd become. He still didn't understand. He still thought the problem was what he'd lost, not what he was. She kept the polite smile, but her eyes turned hard as diamond. "Michael," she said, her voice calm but final. "Some mistakes aren't just mistakes. They're choices, and your choices created a debt too big to fix." She didn't wait for a response. Just nodded slightly, a definitive gesture of farewell, and turned away, returning to her conversation, leaving him standing in the middle of the room, a ghost at a party that wasn't his. As she walked away, the sound of music and chatter enveloping her again, a clear and luminous thought formed in her mind. He thought he was starting a new life that night at the airport, with a bouquet of sunflowers in his hands, but he was just signing the end of his. It was her, Emily, standing in the shadows, witnessing the betrayal, who had her true life begin in that exact moment. That wasn't the end of her story. It was the prologue, and the rest she was writing now, on her own terms, with ink no one else could erase. What did you think of the story? What score would you give it from 0 to 10? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And don't forget to watch more exciting stories by clicking right here.